Welcome to the Commercial Property Podcast. My name is Suzi Carter. I am a chartered surveyor. I've been involved in commercial property in the UK for 30 years and I've done hundreds of commercial property deals. I'm here to be your guide through the commercial property market, whether you're an experienced investor or whether you're literally thinking about dipping your toe in the world of commercial real estate. I will be here talking to you about all kinds of things commercial real estate in the UK, and I've also got some fantastic guest experts who are joining me. So please do subscribe if you'd like to follow, and if you'd like any more help or information on commercial real estate, please do click www.suzicarter.com, which is my website, and you can find out all the ways I can help you. So stay tuned for this week's episode. Welcome back to the Commercial Property Podcast, and today I'm talking about managing your commercial properties. So you've found the deal, you've got it financed, you've added the value, you've got your money out hopefully, you've got the tenant in place or the tenants in place. So what do you do next? How do you set up systems and processes so that your property is being properly managed, complying with any legislation you need to comply with, but kind of as importantly, you're continuing to add value through your actions. You don't miss anything that you need to be aware of, like rent reviews and lease renewals, and you're absolutely maximizing your commercial real estate. Now, obviously, one of the real benefits of commercial property is that it can be hands-off. So if you've got a full repairing and insuring lease, what that can mean is that you can basically your tenants are your property managers effectively. So they will do all the repairs, the maintenance, they will comply with all the statutes that they need to. And most importantly, they will comply with the lease. Now, the covenants in the lease, so the different clauses in the lease, they will govern how well your tenant is obliged to manage the property. So this is why I always suggest that at the very least, the very first lease that you get prepared is prepared by a solicitor, because it's false economy not to do this, because they can put all the right clauses in place that mean that, you genuinely can be hands off, and the tenant has got obligations to comply with statute, to maintain, to paint, to decorate, etc. And that's really, really important, because the quality of your lease is in direct proportion to how hands-off you need or hands-on you need to be with your property. So that's a really, really important lease point. Make sure you've got a fantastic lease in place that's been prepared by a great commercial lawyer, and you've also run it past, commercial surveyor. Perhaps my clients run leases past me, because it also has to be commercial, it has to be operable, and so that's really, really important. So the quality of your lease is the first place you start at. The second thing is, I would strongly recommend that you consider at least appointing a managing agent. Now, obviously, properties can be single lets, they can be multi-lets, they can be multi-let to 2 or 3 tenants, or they can be multi-let to 80 tenants. That it just varies at the size of the asset. And with the size and complexity comes more and more obligations on compliance, health and safety, insurance, etc. And sometimes it's just not worth navigating that alone, especially if you have a service charge. So if there's common parts, multiple tenants with common areas, shared areas, then you can claim back up to 10% of the managing agent's fees from the service charge. So it's almost false economy to manage that yourself. And there's a good way in managing service charge, and there's a bad way. And so many service charges in the UK are managed badly. The RICS has produced a service charge code which has just been updated. You can find that really easily on their website, which gives you best practice as to how you manage a service charge. But ultimately, because you can claim management fees back, you need to question, is it really worth you having to do this? Because you'll need to do planned maintenance programs. You'll need to look at preparing budgets, get reconciliation statements prepared, making sure that you've got a timely response to repairs, emergencies, etc. And managing agents, bluntly, they're geared up for this. This is what they do. And so obviously you need to find the right managing agent, and you need to give them the right instruction, make sure the scope of the instruction is complete, and make sure that the reporting that they have is good. So for example, I would strongly recommend that at least initially you get a monthly update, which can probably move to quarterly, but you need to really make sure they're on top of everything. And you can have the managing agent doing everything from, just managing a service charge where their fees are generally reclaimable, to collecting rent for you, dealing with all tenants' inquiries. And obviously, the more they deal with, the more hands-off your investment is. Obviously, you may be paying a little bit more away in fees, but the proportions are relatively low, especially if you get a local agent to manage it on your behalf. So sometimes it's just not worth kind of getting involved in this, because there's somebody out there for not a great deal of cost can actually do it so much better. So that's just something to think about. But there's also systems and processes that you will need to set up, which I just personally wouldn't outsource to a third party. So for example, if you have just bought an investment, you've just got it tenanted, let's say you have 3 or 4 tenants in it, then the first thing you need to do is get rent authority letters set up. So you or a managing agent can do that, basically saying where they now need to pay the rent to. And then what you need to do is you need to keep a record of key lease dates. Now, there's a lot of lease dates where things can slip and it's not too bad. But there's also a lot of lease dates where time is of the essence, where timing is super important. And it's really important to be proactive and on the front foot with these things. So just record key lease dates like rent reviews, any tenant break clauses. Tenants can have a break clause, and they usually have to have, for example, their rent paid up to date. No repairs outstanding, perhaps. Every clause is different, and they certainly do need to give a notice period, whether that's 3 months, 6 months, sometimes 12 months. So those notice provisions are super, super important. Then you've got things like lease expiries and renewals. And it's just really important that you keep a track of this. So whether that's in a calendar, in a property management system, whether that's on an Excel spreadsheet, whether you manage it through a VA, doesn't really matter what your system is. You just need to make sure that you're recording this. So for example, if you've got a lease expiry, then probably just over a year, I would have a flag in my property management system that says that this is coming up. What that means is that I can find the right person to do that rent review, do that lease renewal for me. But the same is actually applicable for rent reviews. I would be kind of still having this early warning system. Because there's going to be certain agents locally who do all the rent reviews or all the lease renewals. So make sure that you can find that person, you can get them to do a report well ahead of time. And that means that you're not kind of waiting for the tenant to make the first move. You could be highly strategic about it. It's just not worth leaving things to the last minute with regard to that. Obviously, tenant break clauses are super important, because once a tenant break clause has passed and they haven't activated it, then potentially you've got a longer term on your lease. It might affect your valuation. It might therefore affect your financing. So again, really important to kind of have a track of these dates and understand them. Also, if you've got rent deposits, you need to register rent deposit deeds, a separate bank account, etc. Guarantees and guarantors. So if there's a personal guarantee to the lease, if there's a guarantor, you need to record their details. And as a general rule, with regard to both tenant covenants, to guarantees and guarantors, you want to be checking in on those at least every 6 to 12 months, because people, can sell houses, guarantors can change quality, tenants can, businesses can, trade can be affected by the economy, by the market. They might actually have ceased trading and you don't know anything about it if you don't check up on them. So definitely kind of make it a point of just doing risk scores, doing credit checks, Googling tenants, just understanding them, and have flags in your calendar and in your property management system to make sure that you do this. And diarise ahead of events, just to make sure that you know when this stuff is coming. You also want to make sure that obviously tenants are complying with lease clauses. So that's why even if it's a full repairing and insuring lease, you can go in and do landlord inspections. You can kind of kill two birds with one stone with regard to these. One is you have a look around, and obviously you can send a managing agent to do that. A managing agent will usually have like a tick box checklist where they'll be seeing whether there's boxes piled in front of fire escapes, which happens a lot. Whether smoke alarms are being tested, fire alarms are being tested, etc., etc., and they'll just make sure that they're compliant. So sometimes it's easier for a property management surveyor to do that, but you can definitely do that yourself. But the other benefit of you going yourself to look at your property is that, meet with the tenant, have a coffee with them, have a chat. I think far too many landlords just meet their tenants or just talk to their tenants when there's something, whether in opposition to them, whether that's on a rent review or a lease renewal or a dispute over something. Try and build a relationship so that when you have got these kind of moments when you might actually be kind of working with different interests than the tenant, then you can have some amiable and hopefully straightforward discussions rather than that being the only point of contact that you've got. And, lease clauses can vary, but very often tenants have an obligation to paint, for example, every 3 to 5 years. So are they doing that? What about dilapidations? A lot of, most, if not all, commercial leases have obligations for tenants to keep the properties in repair. And so therefore, are they doing that? So periodic inspections just to make sure that they're doing that is really, really important. And you also want to be tracking, so, whether there's been any alterations made in the property, because very often if a tenant needs to do any alterations, they need to be asking you for consent first. Now, that consent is usually not to be unreasonably withheld or delayed. But if they don't actually ask for that consent, then they're in breach of their lease clauses. So you need to make sure that you're catching up on this to make sure that that is actually happening.
This episode is brought to you by Bond Finance Limited, your trusted partner for commercial property mortgage solutions. Are you an experienced residential property investor about to diversify into commercial property, looking for funding options? Bond Finance can help. Whether you're planning to expand, refinance, or make a major property investment, Bond Finance provides expert advice with access to a wide range of lenders, from high street to specialist. Book a free discovery session today to explore how we can tailor commercial funding solutions to your unique investment strategy. Visit www.bondfinanceltd.co.uk and take the next step in your commercial finance journey.
And if a tenant does apply to you for consent to assign or underlet or do alterations, you have an obligation to reply not to be unreasonably withheld or delayed. Sometimes the lease clauses are different, but that's the most common one. What that means is that you can't sit on that for 6 months and not do it, because deemed consent will deem to being given in law. So it's in your interest to get on with that as much as possible. And the very first thing you'd want to do is ask for an undertaking for costs. So, they want to put some, let's say it's an industrial unit, they want to put a mezzanine floor in. So the first thing you would do is, yes, we'll look at this, but our costs are estimated to be X. And obviously you need to bring in your cost, your time, your lawyers, maybe surveyors that are looking at this, maybe any professionals that you need to, any reports you need to get done, etc., just to make sure it's, structurally sound, etc., etc. So you want to make sure that you are covering all the costs in there, and then you need to wait for them to come back to you. And then, perhaps you might want to consider doing these or paying for these works yourself. So, for example, if a tenant puts a mezzanine floor in, When it comes to rent review, that has to be excluded because it's a tenant's improvement. So you can't rentalise that at rent review. So if you think that that's adding some value to the unit, then why don't you kind of say, well, yeah, okay, you do the work, but we'll pay the cost. So therefore it's a landlord fixture and therefore we can rentalise it at rent review. Obviously you wouldn't say that necessarily to the tenant, but that would be your logic. And then you'll need to kind of get maybe a structural engineer to look at it. You need to do some investigation. You need to get a packet of drawings from them. You need to get method statements and various other things. So, and then you need to get a lawyer to prepare a license for alteration. So, there's a process you need to go through and you need to make sure you're set up for this. So many SME landlords in particular are just not set up for this. So they're surprised when this stuff happens. And this is very normal stuff in property management. So one job of you kind of managing your properties is to set these systems up, have somebody that you can go to who will do these licenses for you, have a surveyor or a managing agent up your sleeve who can actually look at this stuff for you, maybe kind of know of structural engineers you can go to get quotes for all this kind of stuff. So it's really important just to be prepared, because you can't drag your feet with these applications. Otherwise, if it goes on too long, then deemed consent is deemed to have been given. And, so proactivity is super, super important. So, you can manage commercial properties and just never go and see it, never look at it. That's one way of doing it. Or you can be really proactive, monitor the tenant covenants, have early engagement on rent reviews, lease renewals, make sure you're watching out for non-compliance with health and safety or insurance. Make sure that, they're not kind of ruining your EPC rating by doing something at the unit. And generally just kind of getting under the skin of that investment. Now, this is why having a managing agent obviously can be less time consuming, because if you've got a reasonably sized portfolio, then doing this right across the portfolio can be time consuming, but it is definitely worth putting some time in for sure. And you can also, if you think you're going to get voids in your portfolio, think about mitigation of costs. So, for example, do you have a rates mitigation expert that you can go to who will put some temporary storage in there and perhaps help you mitigate some of your rates? So that's perfectly legal. You need to go to a really good operator, but again, kind of think proactively about what you would do if you had voids in your portfolio. And also kind of make sure that you understand when your financing begins and ends in relation to lease expiries, because obviously that could have an impact on valuations and also with regard to your financing. So I guess what I'm trying to stress is that, you can be a good landlord, or you can be a very hands-off landlord, which isn't necessarily being a great landlord. And it's more about the quality of your portfolio and keeping a tenant in the property long term, keeping the rent going long term, making sure that your property isn't damaged. I've got clients who have bought properties where a whole new building has been built by a tenant and the landlord knew nothing about it because they never go and look at it. I would highly recommend that you don't get yourself in that kind of situation. Another obligation of a landlord is to make sure that insurance is maintained. Now, the tenant very often will pay for that, especially with a full repairing insuring lease, but you need to make sure that you have the right insurance policy in place. So make sure you're covering the right number of years for loss of rent in the event that the tenant has to cease trading because the building gets destroyed or damaged or whatever. Making sure that you've noted the tenant on the policy. Make sure you've got the right reinstatement cost and make sure you review that regularly. And lots of other insurance clauses. Make sure you've given a copy to the tenant. Stuff that you can easily put in a checklist and make sure that you do. And obviously have a broker that you can work with on the lease clause, on the insurance clauses, and make sure you read your insurance clauses at least the first time so that you can really understand kind of how it works. And obviously you need to relate that to the lease and make sure that everything is covered. The other thing, obviously, if you've got common parts, so we talked about service charge and how I strongly wouldn't recommend that you recommend that you had a managing agent. appointed is all the testing you need to do. So fire alarm testing, fire risk assessments, emergency lighting, Legionella, gas safety tests, fabric inspections, PAT testing, boiler and plant servicing, air quality monitor, electrical certificates, fire door inspections, smoke alarms. I could go on for a long time, actually, and you'd be very relieved that I'm not going to. But the point is that there's a lot of compliance that needs to happen in buildings. And if that's a tenant's responsibility, you need to make sure they're doing this stuff. I've got a client buying a property at the moment, and there's never been a fire risk assessment prepared by the tenant, and they should definitely have done that. So it's just making sure that you have a calendar where you can remind tenants, ask them to send this information to you, because usually they have to provide documentation on demand, depending on what the lease says. And obviously, if that's your responsibility, make sure that you get a regular report from your managing agent that all this stuff is being carried out, all these compliance testing is being carried out. Now, most of that could be or should be recoverable through the service charge, but sometimes service charges aren't all encompassing. Sometimes there's service charge exclusions that tenants negotiate. So you just need to make sure that you can recover all this cost. But again, this is where being proactive as a manager can really pay dividends. So I would strongly recommend that you consider the use of managing agents, because they've got all this stuff set up, but also the kind of the quality of your instruction, the scope of their instruction, how much you're paying them, and also how regularly they're expected to inspect, how regularly they're expected to report to you, and how they're managing the service charge, etc., is really, really important. But I would strongly recommend that you don't absolve all responsibility. You keep a tracker of key lease dates. You make sure that you understand what kind of repair the property's in, what the tenant's doing there. You check the tenant covenant and the guarantors and the guarantees covenant, and you make sure that you're really proactive on the lease dates. Kind of proactivity is definitely the order of the day. And that is how you make sure that you have a kind of bulletproof asset moving forward. I'm not being pernickety or kind of being a charter surveyor in terms of, you need to do things properly. The reason we're doing this stuff is A, that we're compliant and that we can sleep at night. B, that we hopefully will have this asset that will be performing well for us well into the future. And that's through proactive management. So get those systems set up, form relationships with managing agents, and good luck managing your commercial properties. I'll see you next time on the Commercial Property Podcast.